Greetings, everyone. This is Arunima from Prayogshala, and I'm here on behalf of my co-authors Arathy, Hansika, and Koustav to talk about our paper on what predicts COVID-compliant behaviors in India. The present study is part of a larger global study that has been cited here. Below it are the variables that were assessed in that. The ones that are highlighted in green were picked up from this larger data set for the purpose of the present study. The reason why we were interested in understanding the role of political ideology and collective narcissism in the context of a health based pandemic is that in the inception of the pandemic in India, there were various political drivers who, in their unofficial capacities, were talking about unverified facts about Indian being immune to COVID 19. And we essentially wanted to understand whether that played a role in COVID compliant behaviors in the country. Therefore, we picked up political ideology and collective narcissism. Political ideology has been defined as socially shared competing philosophies of life, and they're competing in the sense that on a continuum, on one hand, you have the left wing, which is associated with internationalism, and on the other hand, you have the right wing, which is associated with nationalism. An extended form of this nationalism is expressed in collective narcissism, which has two components. The first component being the belief in group superiority, and the second component being that the belief that this in group superiority is not recognized by others. Both political ideology and collective narcissism has been found to play predictive roles when it comes to policy support. This was also found in the case of COVID-19, wherein in the United States of America, it was found that liberals as opposed to conservatives are more likely to think that COVID-19 related policies are appropriate. Furthermore, collective narcissism was linked with disagreement with COVID 19 compliant behaviors, wherein it was seen that those who identify as collective narcissists perceive greater barriers to adhering to COVID 19 related prevention guidelines. Moreover, they also perceive greater benefits to not engaging in COVID 19 related prevention behaviors. When it comes to health behaviors and policies regarding health behaviors, another variable that comes to the forefront is that of risk perception. Risk perception has, in the context of COVID 19, as in various other contexts, also been linked with prevention behaviors. Moreover, risk perception has been found to differ across the political spectrum for various issues. Therefore, it becomes essential to study the conjunction of risk perception with political ideology and collective narcissism to assess how these three have an impact on COVID compliant behaviors and other health behaviors. This is precisely what we sought out to answer in the present study, wherein we had two research questions. The first research question dealt with political ideology and whether it plays a predictive role when it comes to COVID compliant behaviors, and also whether this relationship is moderated by the risk perception of COVID 19 and exposure to COVID 19. Similarly, the second research question sought to answer whether collective narcissism plays a predictive role when it comes to COVID compliant behaviors and whether this relationship is moderated by risk perception of COVID 19 and exposure to COVID 19. In both of these models, we controlled for the participants' age, sex, their educational qualification, relationship status, the number of children they have, and where they place themselves on a psychosocioeconomic ladder along with the other citizens of the country. COVID compliant behaviors was operationalized in the present study as policy support, physical hygiene, and physical contact, which I will go into detail later on in the presentation. As I had mentioned before, the present study was inspired by the various political agents talking about Indians' immunity to COVID 19. For the purpose of understanding whether this has an impact on COVID compliant behaviors, we recruited 817 Indians who took part in the study via multi site online entry. Because of missing data, our sample ranged from 210 to 662, and the questionnaires were administered in English and in Bengali. Coming to the questionnaire, these are the various scales that were administered in the present study. Political ideology had one question wherein the participants had to self rate their political views. Collective narcissism had questions on whether the participants believed that their in group deserves special treatment. Risk perception had two components with respect to the likelihood of one's own self and others contracting COVID-19. COVID compliant behaviors, comprising of policy support, physical hygiene, and physical contact, had 5 questions each, making a total of 15 questions. Policy support had questions on whether the participants are in support of the policies that were being put out by the government to mitigate the effects of COVID 19. Physical hygiene had questions on personally relevant sanitizing behaviors, and physical contact had questions on whether the participants have been maintaining social distancing as has been said by the government. We found that COVID compliant behaviors, that is, physical contact, physical hygiene, and policy support, are significantly correlated with political ideology and collective narcissism, with the exception of policy support and political ideology. These were also significantly correlated with risk perception and were internally significantly correlated as well. On the basis of these results, we ran regression analyses to figure out if political ideology and collective narcissism predict COVID compliant behaviors. We found that collective narcissism is what plays a predictive role when it comes to policy support and physical hygiene, and none of the other regressions were found to hold their ground. On the basis of these results, we went ahead and did moderation analysis to understand whether the relationship between collective narcissism and COVID compliant behavior comprising of policy support and physical hygiene is moderated by risk perception of COVID 19 and exposure to COVID 19. However, these moderations were not found to be significant. The finding of the present study that collective narcissism is linked with physical hygiene was in the expected direction. What is interesting is that it was not linked with physical contact. This can be understood by the finding of another study wherein it was found that collective narcissism is linked with heightened self prevention and lowered other prevention behaviors. This is exactly what was found in the present study as well, wherein if we scrutinize the items we had for the respective scales, self prevention is expressed in physical hygiene, wherein the questions were with respect to sanitizing foreign objects, sanitizing your hands. On the other hand, other prevention behaviors, which comprises of meeting other people and wearing masks around other people and maintaining social distancing, those are exactly the kind of questions we had for physical contact. Therefore, it is no surprise that collective narcissism was linked with physical hygiene and not with physical contact. Moreover, what is even more interesting is the finding of another study that collective narcissism is linked with preventative behaviors only through their beliefs regarding COVID 19. What these indicate is that even though people who identify as collective narcissists may support the policies that are put out by the government, they will only, rather, they are more likely to engage in self prevention and not in other prevention behaviors. We had hypothesized that political ideology would play a predictive role when it comes to COVID compliant behaviors in India. However, that was not found to be the case. We wanted to further understand, if not political ideology, what is it that plays a predictive role when it comes to COVID compliant behaviors in the country. Therefore, we looked at all of the variables that were part of the larger study that I had mentioned before. And please look at the ones in the mid section that are highlighted in green. Um, and these are essentially the ones that I'll be talking about in the next few slides. Open mindedness in the present study was operationalized as openness to others' thought. Morality as cooperation had questions on when deciding what is moral. Do people take cooperative and altruistic actions into account? Social belongingness was with respect to connectedness with others. Trait self control had questions on resisting temptation. Narcissism had questions on whether one believes themselves to be special. And moral identity had questions on wherein the participants had to imagine what a moral person would act like. To understand what explains COVID compliant behaviors in India, we ran lasso analyses with all of the previously listed variables. We found that open mindedness, moral identity, and social belongingness explain policy support. Secondly, we found that morality as cooperation, open mindedness, and trait self control explain physical hygiene. And lastly, we found that morality as cooperation, collective narcissism, and narcissism best explain physical contact. So, as you can see across these three COVID compliant behaviors, morality as cooperation and moral identity emerge to be important variables. So, let's look at the kind of moral decisions that one has to take in the context of COVID-19. On one hand, you have people who believe that social distancing is one's moral duty, which is what Leonard and Lowe found in 2020. And on the other hand, you have people who believe that aiding the economy is what is a moral thing to do, which is what Sample found in 2020. So these people believe that any other actions are immoral and it will harm the economy and increase unemployment. Looking at the other explainers of policy support, previous research has also linked open mindedness with COVID compliant behaviors and also with intended future behaviors. Perceived fairness has been found to moderate the relationship between political ideology and policy support, which is why it is no surprise that morality also explains policy support. Lastly, social belongingness has been found to promote compliance and helping behavior, which is exactly what is the need of the hour and which is exactly what COVID compliant behaviors are. Therefore, these three things explaining policy support come as no surprise. Apart from open mindedness, physical hygiene was also found to be explained by morality as cooperation and trait self control. Here, even though physical hygiene had questions with respect to personally relevant sanitizing behavior, there is some amount of cooperation and some amount of other beneficial behaviors that is also necessitated and that is also expressed in physical hygiene in the context of COVID-19. When it comes to trait self control, there are certain things that we're trying to unlearn, such as touching one's face. And there are certain things that we're trying to learn, such as wearing a mask, sanitizing every other foreign object, and things like that. Therefore, these play a very important role when it comes to physical hygiene. Apart from the previously discussed variables of cooperation and collective narcissism, narcissism was also found to explain physical contact. Narcissism has previously also been linked with presenting socially desirable answers. Therefore, it remains to be seen whether people who identify as narcissists are only giving these sort of responses or if they're actually engaging in these sort of behaviors as well. With this, I have explained all of the results that we found, and now we move on to the limitations of the study. The present study is not without its limitations, especially the generalizability is hampered owing to it being conducted online. Moreover, the scale on political ideology had only one item, that too with high face validity. Therefore, future research can attempt to collect behavioral data that establishes causal links between the variables of interest. Furthermore, analyses on the variables that emerge to be important, such as open mindedness, social desirability, can be conducted, and a pre post analysis can be conducted with different points in the lockdown to yield greater insight into human behavior. To conclude, collective narcissism is what was found to play a predictive role when it comes to COVID compliant behaviors in India. These were also explained by variables such as open mindedness and moral identity. This not only gives great insight into human behavior, it also points to the need of customizing policies as these variables might not emerge as important in different nations. It also becomes increasingly important to understand the context in which studies like these are carried. In the present study, the context was that of political drivers substantiating unverified claims, which is also what could explain why collective narcissism predicted COVID compliant behaviors. To sum it up, pushing out customized guidelines in a timely fashion becomes really important in a pandemic like COVID 19. This is the list of references that we use for the present study and can be made available if need be. Thank you so much for your interest and for having me. Please feel free to get in touch with any of us in case of any queries.